Good evening and welcome to today's BIC streams for presentation by Kavita Singh titled Word Against Image in Mughal Chronicles, Reading Between the Lines and Colors. Professor Singh's lecture is based on her work that appears in the volume Reflections on Mughal Art and Culture, edited by Rhoda Ahluwalia and published by Niyogi Books. I think you have the book there, Kavita. Yes, that's it. She comes to us from Delhi today to give us a close look at some paintings and the texts that accompanied them from the extraordinary arts of the book in the Mughal world. Welcome to our program, Kavita.
Thank you, Prateeti. It's such a pleasure to be here. The big streams have been so stimulating and exciting. I try not to miss them, and it's an honor to be part of this series.
Thank you. For a brief introduction, Kavita Singh is professor at the School of Arts and Aesthetics at Jawaharlal Nehru University, where she teaches courses in the history of Indian painting and the history and politics of museums. Among her many honors, she was awarded the Infosys Prize in Humanities in 2018 and was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2020. A detailed biography with more of her publications is available at the link provided on our website. Professor Singh will take questions from the audience after her talk. You can type your questions in the Q&A box as we go along. Over to you, Kavita.
Thank you very much. I want to start by thanking my friend Mohan Rao for having suggested me to the Bangalore International Center, because I really do feel very honored to be part of this series that has given me a lot of pleasure and afforded a lot of stimulation in the past few months. It's really an extraordinary series, and I have to thank and congratulate Raghu and Lekha and all the others at the center who've been putting it together so beautifully, such a wonderfully curated series. I want to thank, of course, Prateeti for taking out the time to be the discussant today, and to all of you who are joining us and setting aside part of your evening to listen to this talk. Before I came into art history, I actually studied literature. And because of that, I've been interested in narrative art. And I've been interested in looking at the many forms that are taken by the relationship between word and image. And so when I started studying Mughal art, I found that many of the most celebrated images that I was seeing published again and again came from chronicles. They came from books that recorded the history of this or that emperor's reign. For quite a while, I was just content looking at the images. But when I started reading the text, in translation, of course, I realized that the images and the words didn't often say the same thing. And so in today's talk, which is published in this wonderful new book that is edited by Rhoda Ahluwalia, Reflections on Mughal Art and Culture, which I believe is going to be the subject of a subsequent program. So in this essay, I have tried to look at the gap that often lies between what the word says and what the image means in these illustrated books that are produced in the Imperial atelier. And I want to try and open out a discussion about what it means when word and image are not in concert with each other, but actually act against each other. Before I begin, my dog is scratching at the door to be let in, so just excuse me while I get her in, otherwise there'll be hell to pay. Okay, I've been reunited with my pet, and I think I'm ready to share my screen. Is it already full screen? Is it visible?
Yes, it is.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So let me start by looking at the relationship of word and image in Mughal manuscripts by taking you into an atelier or a kitabkhana by showing you this rather well-known image from an Akhlaq-i Nasiri manuscript, which we are told shows us the inside of the kitabkhana, the atelier, where these beautifully illustrated books were produced. We are seeing here a young man receiving instructions from his teacher. And you can see that he is holding a pen and he's practicing calligraphy. But it's also worth noting the little cups of color that lie at his feet, even as he is practicing writing. We see that when he's in this room, he also must be learning how to paint. And so we are seeing a pupil over here who is learning two of the key skills that are needed to produce the beautiful books that once filled the Mughal library. As though to make the interrelation between these two arts, the art of the word and the art of the image, even more clear, we see on the step below him two artists sitting side by side, one of whom is a calligrapher who is writing, and the other who is an artist who is making a sketch. This shows us how those who wrote the words in the books and those who produced the illustrations for the books worked so closely side by side. In another manuscript, a very, very famous Khamsa of Nizami, we see a colophon page, which is the last page of the book that actually gives the names of the artists who produced the book. It has this double portrait. And again, we see the calligrapher on the right, we see the painter on the left, and we see how they are working so companionably side by side, suggesting the very close collaboration that existed between those two kinds of artists in the kitabkhana. As the scribe and the illustrator were two of the major contributors to the making of the book, it seems only natural that they should be exhibiting this kind of neighborliness. But what about the works that they produced? Were the words and the pictures inside the book as companionable as their makers are shown to be? Did the text and image always work in unison, the one echoing or amplifying or clarifying the other? Or did they sometimes offer different takes of the same narrative? Takes that were not only not complementary, but that sometimes actively disagreed, contradicted, and undercut one another. And if so, if it was the case that the image actually could work against the very text that it was supposed to illustrate, then how should we understand this gap that arose between them? When we see this discrepancy between word and image, and we often see this discrepancy, should we see the discrepancy between the visual and the textual narrative as something that is inevitable, simply arising from the difference between the two media? Does this discrepancy reflect the different authorial voices of the painter and the writer? Or was there a structural difference between the role that was to be played by the maker of the words and the maker of the images? Were images expected to serve a function that was different from that of the text? And then if we take a step back from the makers of the book and we think about the reader who is presented with two different, sometimes two significantly different versions of the same event within the covers of the same book, indeed on facing pages, we need to think about how the reader might have absorbed the text, the image, and most significantly, how they might have understood the gap between the two. Because wouldn't this gap become something that was visible to the reader? And if so, wouldn't the gap itself be seen as something meaningful, producing a semantics of its own? Would the gap between words and images not become the space in which a third text would arise, one that was not entirely written in the words or entirely rendered through the pictures, but was created in the reader's mind as she mentally traverses the distance that exists between these two? These are some of the conjectures that came to my mind from time to time as I was looking at Mughal illustrations. And I want to pursue them today by looking with you at a number of Mughal paintings in conjunction with the text that they accompany. I've chosen to look at paintings in this case just from historical manuscripts, and not just any historical manuscripts, but specifically from the Padshahnama, which is the account of Shah Jahan's life, from the Jahangirnama, which is the account of Jahangir's life, and the Akbarnama, which is the account of Akbar's life. And I have chosen to look at paintings from these books for some quite obvious reasons. Because when an artist is tasked with illustrating a literary text, a work of fiction, let's say a Laila Majnu story, for instance, the artist may well have been encouraged and rewarded for coming up with an original interpretation, something that plays with the text, interprets it in a new light, even goes beyond the text. But the production of these official, authorized biographies of the emperors would have been a very different matter. Because when the production of these books was underway, they would have been among the most prestigious projects in the atelier at the time. They would have been very close to the heart of the patrons. And one imagines that every aspect of the making of that book, from the text to the calligraphy, to the painting, to the border decoration, to the binding, to the quality of the paper that is chosen for it, all of it would have been very closely supervised. And so in such projects, which are so closely monitored, the obligation to adhere to the authorized version of events would have been particularly strongly felt. And so when text and image are at variance with each other in these kinds of manuscripts, then their divergence from each other can't be an accident. It has to be programmatic. It has to be part of the way the books are supposed to communicate. They are part of the meaning that the book bore. Let me begin this exploration by taking you to the Padshahnama and to a particularly celebrated painting within it. The Padshahnama is the official account of Shah Jahan's life. It's written by a litterateur at court, Abdul Hamid Lahori, and in a manuscript where every painting is of absolutely extraordinary quality, the leaf that I want us to look at is considered a particular masterpiece. This painting shows the beheading of Khan Jahan Lodi, a man who had once been in Shah Jahan's service, but had rebelled against him. And the rebellion was a serious challenge to Shah Jahan's authority. And so the emperor's forces actually pursued Khan Jahan Lodi for 2 years before he was finally hunted down. In the end, Khan Jahan Lodi was killed, his head was cut off, and it was sent to be displayed at the gate of the Imperial fort at Agra. Now, the majority of the illustrations of the Padshahnama are Darbar scenes, in which an enthroned Shah Jahan is shown presiding over a court that is thickly populated with courtiers and guards and attendants and grooms and so on. Our painting, which is very masterfully rendered by the artist Abid, also shows a very carefully rendered assembly of generals and officials from Shah Jahan's court. However, the emperor is absent. The scene is set outdoors in a stylized mountainscape, which is reminiscent of Persian painting. And you see a row of soldiers peeping over the horizon to gaze at the event that is taking place in the foreground. Here in the foreground, 2 men are bending over a difficult task. They are sawing through the bones and the sinews of Khan Jahan Lodi's neck in order to behead him. And although Khan Jahan Lodi is still alive, the blood has drained out of his body. His face is taking on the pallor of death. On the ground nearby, there are the heads of 3 others who have been already executed. These decapitated heads are gray, they are nearly black. They are entirely lacking in lifeblood. When we look at this painting with its detailed rendering of people and things, we know that we are seeing a particular man at a particular moment of a particularly grisly event. And yet, for all the attention to detail that we see here, and for all the horrifyingly fascinating rendering of death and decaying flesh, this painting cannot be taken to be an accurate eyewitness account, because it offers a narrative of Khan Jahan's death, which veers very far away from the account given in Abdul Hamid Lahori's text. We know, for instance, that while Khan Jahan Lodi's head was indeed cut off and it was sent to Shah Jahan as a trophy, it was cut off from a body that was already dead, that had been pierced by the lance of Madho Singh of Bundi, a Rajput prince who was in Shah Jahan's service. According to Lahori's text, Madhu Singh was in the party that launched the final assault on Khan Jahan Lodi, and he killed the former governor Lodi as well as two of his sons. But Madhu Singh is shown here at lower right in Abid's painting. He's the figure clad in orange who is prominently holding the lance that he has wielded this day with so much success. But while the figure of the Rajput prince is very prominent, it is also very passive. He is shown as though he's witnessing the execution instead of having any hand in performing it. If we look at the middle register of the painting, it's dominated by the figures of two symmetrically arranged warriors who are standing beside their horses. These are the two leaders of the force that had pursued Khan Jahan Lodi. On the left, clad in gray armor, you see Abdullah Khan. And on the right, wearing a white coat, you see Sayyid Muzaffar Khan Badha. And Lahori tells us that these two men had led the force that had captured Khan Jahan Lodi, and that Abdullah Khan in particular is the person who had personally cut the head of Khan Jahan Lodi's body and had ensured that it was dispatched to Shah Jahan. In fact, when we see several Mughal albums with subsequent portraits of Abdullah Khan, they all show him holding the head of Khan Jahan Lodi, suggesting that Abdullah Khan was chiefly remembered for this triumph, for which he was also very richly rewarded by Shah Jahan. And yet, like Madho Singh, Abdullah Khan is shown simply attending Khan Jahan's decapitation. He is not shown as though he performed it. So if agency is taken away from the two main actors in this drama, then to whom is it given in their stead? Who are these two figures who are shown cutting Khan Jahan Lodi's heads? If we look at them closely, we see that there are inscriptions on their figures. Two words are written in black ink on the shoulder of the man who faces us. But instead of giving his name, it simply reads Shah Jahani, or belonging to Shah Jahan, or of Shah Jahan. The other figure who has his back to us bears a subtler inscription, because as though woven into the edge of his coat, there is a benediction that blesses the emperor a long life. And from these inscriptions, it becomes clear that the artist Abid doesn't intend for these executioners to be identified as real living individuals who were involved in the capture of Khan Jahan. Rather, they are abstract figures who just emblematize service to Shah Jahan. So if the two men who actually killed and beheaded Khan Jahan Lodi seem merely to attend the scene, to look upon it, then in what I find the most disturbing twist in this painting, Khan Jahan Lodi is also made to attend the scene of his own execution. Because instead of showing him as being already dead before his head is cut off, which he was, Abid paints Khan Jahan Lodi as though he was living and sentient and conscious and attending his own execution with wide open eyes. In the hands of the artist, Khan Jahan's last moments seem to be filled with this realization where he understands what he has done to deserve this fate. It seems to me that Khan Jahan Lodi's open eyes are the crux of a painting whose central theme is the witnessing of a wrathful justice being done. The act of seeing is multiplied many times in this painting, as the execution is witnessed by so many people on the scene. There's the theatrical chorus of soldiers arranged behind the horizon line in the background. There is the knot of soldiers in the foreground. There are the solemn commanders who stand by their horses. And in contrast to all those who look upon the event, you have the decapitated eyes of the heads that lie on the ground, which are all shut, as though they do not deserve to look upon the majesty of the scene. They are traitors. Their eyes have to be shut because you have to bow your eyes before the majesty that is there. But whose majesty is it that these traitors are not allowed to see? If we compare this painting with the kind of Darbar scenes that the Pachanama usually has, we see that the Darbar scene on the right here, they're usually arranged in 3 registers, which reproduce the hierarchical space of the Shahjahani audience hall. There, the lowest register usually shows attendants and servants who are standing outside the hall. The central register of the painting is occupied by those of higher rank who stand within the hall's golden or silver railings. But the highest register is reserved for the emperor himself, who is seen in his magnificently decorated and elevated throne. So if we juxtapose a Darbar scene with Abid's death of Khan Jahan Lodi, we can see how the outdoor scene also reproduces the format of the formal audience at court, where Madho Singh, or the men who actually are shown cutting Khan Jahan Lodi's head, become located at the lowest level, as though they were just servants of the court. By placing the 2 commanders at the level of the high-ranking courtiers who stand close to the ruler in the Darbar, Abid manages to lift them to a higher level. So you have Abdullah Khan and Syed Hussain Bara at the level of the high-ranked noblemen at court. And above them, there rises a chinar tree, a tree that was beloved of the Mughal rulers, which in Mughal poetry had been dubbed the king of trees. Could this king of trees stand in for the king of men? As we look more closely at the painting, we see how the ground beneath the chinar tree is sprinkled with flowers. These seem at first to be part of the landscape, but the flowers are concentrated only at the foot of the tree, as though forming a decorative carpet for it. Just as flowers appear in the carpets, in the hangings, in the inlay panels that are clustered around Shah Jahan's throne in the Darbar, as though to concentrate all the beauty of the world around his presence. So for me, the location of the flowers in the outdoor painting at the base of the chinar tree confirms that the chinar tree is actually a metaphor for Shah Jahan's own self. When Shah Jahan sent his forces to hunt down Khan Jahan Lodi, he remained in the capital. He was far from the battlefield. Yet, by imposing the structure of the Darbar upon the battlefield, by letting the symbolic representation of the emperor preside over the scene, Abid finds a way to make Shah Jahan present despite his absence. And now the shifting of agency away from the actors begins to make sense, because Abid doesn't deny the role of Madhu Singh or Abdullah Khan. He gives both of them a prominent place in his composition, but he takes their actions away from them. And by doing this, Abid is suggesting that Madhu Singh or Abdullah Khan were simply instruments of the emperor's will. What they did was not of their doing. It was Shah Jahan's might that animated them. Now, those who held the Pachanama in their hands and who turned its pages would have seen Abid's painting alongside a text that describes the campaign against Khan Jahan Lodi in a lot of detail. And there, the skirmishes between the imperial and the rebel forces are recounted over several pages. There is no obfuscation of the role of Madhu Singh or of Abdullah Khan. So, seen alongside the text, Abid's manipulation of the scene would have become very clearly visible to the reader. And the gap between the text's account and the painting's account would have become a very important part of the painting's rhetorical flourish. It would have prompted the reader to seek out its implications. By turning the battlefield into an alfresco Darbar, by suggesting the omnipresence of a ruler who is actually far away, by making the warriors witnesses rather than actors, by rendering Khan Jahan Lodi as alive so that he can witness his own beheading, and by doing all of this next to a text that gives a painstaking but plodding account of the incident, Abid is showing how a painting can offer a layered and symbolic account of the same event. The painting doesn't deviate from the text as much as it transcends it. And by altering and rearranging pictorial space or composition or motifs, Abid is making a claim on behalf of the art of painting, arguing that it can take you to a place that is much higher than the place of prose. Let me turn now to the Jahangirnama. Unlike the Pachanama, which was a formal chronicle written by a courtier, the Jahangirnama was a memoir. It was a kind of a diary kept by the emperor himself. Illustrating the Jahangirnama must have been a major project for the Imperial workshop during Jahangir's time, but somehow this grand Jahangirnama manuscript was never actually assembled, and the paintings that were made for it were eventually scattered far and wide. And so the painting that we are going to look at is one such scattered leaf. It records an event that is connected with the rebellion mounted by Jahangir's eldest son, Khusro. Back when Jahangir was still the Prince Salim, he had rebelled against his father Akbar. And powerful factions at court had been urging Akbar to pass over Salim and to appoint Salim's very popular and very capable eldest son, Khusro, as Akbar's successor. Khusro's supporters who were urging Akbar to do this included some very powerful people, including Abul Fazl, who was Akbar's biographer, who wrote the Akbarnama, and who also was an intimate companion of Akbar's. Another proponent of Khusro was Raja Man Singh, the ruler of Amber, who was an extremely powerful Mansabdar of Akbar's, and whose sister was Jahangir's wife, who was the mother of Khusro. So Man Singh was his uncle, Khusro's own uncle. And then there was Khusro's own father-in-law, who was Mirza Aziz Koka, who was the son of one of Akbar's wet nurses. So since these two boys had suckled milk from the same breast, Aziz Koka was a milk brother to Akbar and had become a very powerful commander and governor in Akbar's reign. So contrary to the expectations and the urgings of Abul Fazl, the intimate friend, Man Singh, the uncle of Khusro, Aziz Koka, the father-in-law of Khusro, all very close to Akbar. So contrary to their expectations and urgings, at the last minute, Salim and Akbar were reconciled, Khusro was passed over, and the crown went to Salim, who ascended the throne and took the regnal name of Jahangir. At first, when this happened, Khusro seemed to accept this turn of events. But just a few months after his father's accession, he led a small band of followers to an ill-fated revolt. Jahangir set out in hot pursuit of Khusro almost immediately. On leaving Agra, Jahangir first went to Sikandra, to the tomb of his father Akbar, where he says, and I quote, "I sought assistance from my father's spirit," unquote. Here, while they were at Sikandra, just hours after setting off on this campaign to capture Khusro, Jahangir's soldiers actually came upon an ally of Khusro's who had lost his way and was unable to join Khusro's band. And it is this encounter where this unfortunate ally has been captured that we are seeing before us. For Jahangir, the capturing of this young man was a good omen. It served as confirmation that Akbar's blessings were with him and that it was just and right for Jahangir to defend his right to succeed Akbar. In the context of this background, the buildings that we see in the rear of this painting become significant because they don't just mark the geographical location in which this event took place, but they also put Jahangir in a context that marks his lineage as well as his filial piety, his devotion towards his parents. The red sandstone building that we're seeing on the upper left is Akbar's tomb at Sikandra. In the Jahangirnama, Jahangir tells us that the tomb had been pretty much built once when he saw it, and he wasn't satisfied with the way it had come out. And so, notwithstanding the large amount of money that had already been spent on it, he didn't hesitate to have much of it pulled down and rebuilt to a new design. Now, scholars have pointed out that although the painting that we are seeing depicts an event that happened just after Jahangir came to the throne, so historically the event occurred in 1606, the painter actually shows Akbar's tomb as it existed in its finished form, the way it was reconstructed by Jahangir, which was completed only 8 years later in 1614. What scholars haven't noted is the presence of another building at the right edge of the painting. The eaves that we are seeing peeping out from the right edge most likely belong to the tomb of Maryam-uz-Zamani, Jahangir's mother, which Jahangir had constructed a short distance from Akbar's tomb at Sikandra, just after his mother died in 1623. And the tall building in the center, which is the Church of St. John of the Wilderness in Sikandra, which is a building that is surmounted by a barely visible cross, is the thing that we see in the center. If we look at Google Maps today, we see the relative locations of these three buildings, even now roughly maps onto the way they have been shown by the artist in this painting. Now, of course, it is anachronistic for the painter to show the tombs in this depiction of an event that took place much before the buildings were made. Was the painter simply depicting the Sikandra that he knew? Was he deliberately introducing these later structures into his depiction to show the care that Jahangir had taken of his parents' final resting place, to show what a good son he was, in order to show how different he was from the disloyal son of his own, Khusro, whom he was now pursuing? If we turn to the foreground of the painting, we see the details of the capture of Mirza Hussain. This poor captive whom we are seeing at the left edge of this detail is got his hands bound. He's being forced to bow to Jahangir, and Jahangir is mounted on a horse and towering over his prisoner. His body dominates the page, and the gold-colored envelope of space that surrounds him seems to create a halo for his entire body. All the other figures, which include many very high officials of state, are all crowded together. They're drawn on a slightly smaller scale than Jahangir. Directly behind Jahangir is Farid Bukhari, who was eventually to capture Khusro himself. Behind him is Mahabat Khan, who was a military commander who was also to have a very prominent career. But the courtier who is most prominently depicted in this crowd of courtiers who follows Jahangir is Mirza Aziz Koka. Aziz Koka, we remember, was Khusro's father-in-law. He had been part of the faction at court that had supported Khusro's claim to the throne before Jahangir's succession. Would Aziz Koka have participated in a campaign to capture Khusro? I'd like to tell you that the artist has fancifully inserted the figure and shown him so prominently participating in the capture to underline the fact that Jahangir was on the right side and even Khusro's father-in-law had turned against him. But the fact is that Aziz Koka's presence is not a flourish that is added by the artist. It is actually supplied by Jahangir's text. And I quote Jahangir's text here, where he says, "When it was noon and the heat was at its highest, I stopped for a moment in the shade of a tree and I said to Aziz Koka, imagine what state that wretch," meaning Khusro, "imagine what state that wretch must be in." Now, Jahangir's account of the day has all the events that took place in it crowded into one paragraph. There's no mention of any other companion or any conversation. So this innocuous remark addressed to Aziz Koka really stands out in the text. And its only purpose seems to be to very ostentatiously draw attention to the fact that Aziz Koka was present. His participation in this campaign against Khusro becomes not just a declaration of Aziz's personal obedience to his emperor, but it acts as a confirmation of the legitimacy of Jahangir's right to the throne and the utter illegitimacy of Khusro's pretensions. And yet, despite this assertion of Aziz's loyalty, we know that Jahangir never trusted Aziz. He even feared him. When Akbar was on his deathbed, Jahangir didn't dare to enter the palace to see his father for fear that Aziz Koka and Man Singh would assassinate him. And he came to Akbar's deathbed only after they gave him assurances that he would be safe. After Jahangir's coronation, when Khusro revolted, Jahangir was convinced that Aziz Koka and Man Singh had fomented this rebellion. When Khusro was captured, instead of having him executed, Jahangir chose to have him blinded and kept in chains for the rest of his life. Khusro's wife, Aziz Koka's daughter, remained by Khusro's side, and she even bore him children in captivity. This continued presence of Khusro and his wife would surely have placed a tremendous psychic burden on all the protagonists involved in this sorry drama. And it's telling that a year after Khusro's capture, Jahangir seems to have dealt with this emotional burden by accusing Aziz Koka of some trumped up charges of treachery, not against himself, but in the distant past against his father, Akbar, and by stripping the elderly governor of his estates. Jahangir even had Aziz Koka imprisoned and he released him only after 2 years when Akbar appeared to him in a dream and asked Jahangir to let Aziz go. So where in this painting is the gap between the word and the image? Actually, for me, the gap is made open by the way in which Aziz Koka is so deliberately and prominently presented in this scene from the campaign against Khusro. In this case, it's not a gap between the text and the image because we have seen how both text and image prominently mark Aziz Koka's attendance on this scene. But if we think of this painting that was made years after the event, years after Khusro was caught, was blinded, was placed in chains, after Aziz Koka had been dishonored, imprisoned, then forgiven and freed, the gap would actually lie in the interstices between what the book says, both in its words and its paintings on the one hand, and what every reader of the book would know on the other hand about the relationship between Aziz Koka and Jahangir. It is here that what is represented and what is known don't map onto each other, creating in the reader that third text of their own. Let me turn now to the third and final image of the day. And this occurs in the Akbarnama, the Imperial biography of Akbar, which was produced as lavishly illustrated manuscripts. The most famous version of the Akbarnama that many of us usually see illustrations of published here and there belong to a version that was made in the late 1580s, and most of it is now in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. But the second copy, which was made 10 years later, takes up many themes for illustration that are not attempted in the first manuscript. And the page that we are turning to is one such. One evening, the writer of the Akbarnama, Abul Fazl, courtier, litterateur, loyal friend, and almost devotee of Akbar, tells us, discourse fell upon the bravery of the heroes of Hindustan, the Rajputs, and it was stated that they paid no regard to their lives. For instance, some Rajputs would hold a double-headed spear, and two men who were equally matched would run from opposite sides against the spear so that the latter would transfix them and come out at their backs. So you have these men kind of taking a bet and killing themselves just to show that they're not afraid of killing themselves. On hearing this, Akbar suddenly decided that he would equal this feat. Abul Fazl tells us, he fastened a special sword to a wall and placing the point near his sacred breast, he declared that if Rajputs were wont to sell their valor in this way, he too could rush against his sword. So the whole party was watching in horror as Akbar drunkenly prepared to impale himself on his own sword on a whim. Only Man Singh of Amer, Akbar's brother-in-law and very close personal friend, had the courage to act, and he struck the sword down. As the sword fell, it cut Akbar's hand, and an infuriated Akbar seized Man Singh and threw him to the ground and began to throttle him. To save Man Singh, another man called Sayyid Muzaffar then intervened. He seized Akbar's injured hand, and by twisting that wounded finger, he released Man Singh. Now, in this extraordinary event is given a double-page illustration by the artist Daulat in this second version of the Akbarnama, which is made very close to the end of Akbar's reign. The scene, as we can see, is set in an enclosed garden that has been decked out for the evening's gathering. And here, surrounded by a ring of astonished courtiers, Akbar pins Man Singh to the ground. The Amber Raja's yellow turban is unraveling. His face is contorted. His mouth is open as though he's gasping for breath. His arms are futilely trying to lift his body off the ground. Akbar too is in an undignified position. He's kneeling on the ground beside Man Singh. He's pressing down on his neck with one hand. He's digging the other arm's elbow into Man Singh's back. And his face, which is usually a serene mask in other portraits, here has a furrowed brow and a scowl. And this must be a grimace of pain because the painting also shows Sayyid Muzaffar in the yellow coat restraining Akbar by twisting his injured thumb. There is nothing in this painting that dignifies Akbar. He's not shown at the only moment in the episode that could have been construed as heroic, which was when he pointed the sword at himself. Rather, he is shown at a moment when he is treating a close ally who has just saved his life in a shameful manner. As the painting shows Sayyid Muzaffar twisting Akbar's hand, it also underlines Akbar's vulnerability, which arises from a small injury. So if the narrative moment that was chosen by the artist Daulat doesn't dignify Akbar, then his composition also refuses to give the emperor a place of honor. If we look at the whole double page, we see that the composition places Akbar in the lower half of the painting instead of letting him occupy the apex. Akbar is not drawn here on a scale that is larger than the others. Even more damningly, Akbar is placed in the left half of the double page. In a literary culture whose script reads from right to left, paintings too tend to follow this textual reading order by usually putting the dominant, more active figures on the right, keeping the passive figures on the left. And you can see in most other paintings of this Akbarnama, Akbar is painted on the right. And in this painting, which shows Akbar venting his fury on Man Singh, the reversal of the normal compositional order actually occurs twice over, because not only is Akbar shown on the left half of the double page painting, but he is also placed to the left of the little knot of figures of which he is a part. It is Said Muzaffar who is the active one in this group, standing at the right and seizing and twisting Akbar's hand. So this painting seems shockingly frank, showing Akbar as vulnerable and wrong-headed. In this, it is predictably at variance with Abul Fazl's text, which is famous for being overblown and full of circumlocutions and hyperbole. At the start of his magnum opus, Abul Fazl had made it clear that he did not regard Akbar as an ordinary man, but as the insani kamil, the perfect man. Akbar is the descent of the one ineffable God on earth. As a result, the Akbarnama is framed less as the account of a man's life and more as a kind of a moral exemplum where every act and utterance of Akbar is presented as proof of his greatness. And things that are difficult to understand or to condone when Akbar behaves badly are explained by Abul Fazl as evidence that Akbar's greatness is so great that it's beyond human comprehension. So it was with this event, where Abul Fazl begins thus: the sitter on the throne of the caliphate, that is Akbar, the caliph of the age, is always shrouding himself under a special screen, while the stewards of fate are ever removing the screen and displaying the spiritual and physical glories of him who has been magnified by God. One night, there was a select drinking party, discourse fell upon the bravery of the heroes of Hindustan, and so on and so forth. Now, from this small hint of the drinking party, we realize that Akbar must have been drunk that night. But Abul Fazl tells us that Akbar was completely conscious of what he was doing and he was in control of himself, for he acted for the sake of screening his glory and for testing men. So his erratic behavior is calculated to make the emperor appear to be a fallible human so that he can test the loyalty of his companions, who did in this case actually succeed in saving him from himself. In the Akbarnama's text, the dice are loaded against poor Said Muzaffar, who gets no credit at all, because the text accusingly says he foolishly tried to free Man Singh from the grasp of that tiger of God by twisting his wounded finger and released Man Singh. And for Abul Fazl, the final outcome of this episode again offers proof of God's favor upon Akbar, not because Man Singh tried to save Akbar's life, not because Said Muzaffar saved Man Singh's life, but because although Akbar's hand suffered a cut, by the divine protection, it soon healed. As we can see in Abul Fazl's adoring vision, Akbar's erratic behavior is proof of his inscrutability, and the ordinary processes of healing from a wound become proof of God's divine blessings upon him. As with the Jahangirnama and the Pachanama, there is a gap between the word and the image in the Akbarnama, a gap which is of a slightly different sort this time, because in the Akbarnama, it is the text, which is written by a courtier and a professional literature, that is hyperbolic. The image doesn't carry any of the rhetorical weight. It shows Akbar in a frank and unflattering manner. And although we have focused on an Akbarnama painting that is an extreme instance of this tendency, in general, Akbarnama paintings are not as flattering or as highly wrought as the Akbarnama text. In images, Akbar appears as a man. He may be an extraordinary man, a very dynamic man, but he is still a man. Thus, in most paintings, Akbar is shown off-center, not particularly large, not greatly separated from other men. And it is in the text that he is divinized and he is wrapped in layer upon layer of purple prose. What should we make of this gap? Remembering that Akbar couldn't read the written word, but that he delighted in images, might we imagine Akbar hearing the flattering words in the honeyed tongue of his courtier, but taking the book of his life into his own hands? Might he not have smiled at the memories stirred by the images that he saw? It's not my intention today to try and persuade you that Mughal paintings are unreliable as records of history. Of course they are. but that's hardly a point that needs to be labored. Nor is it my intention today to privilege text over image as a source of historical truth. As we've seen in the few examples that we've discussed today, texts also prevaricate, they also embroider, they also obfuscate the facts. Rather, my focus has been on the relationship between text and image, what is known and what is shown, where the differences between them would create awareness of the act of interpretation that informs both the word and the image. And this work of interpretation, already done by the writer, already done by the artist, is now laid at the reader's feet for her to do her share. Let me end this with a diversion by moving away from the Mughal realm to the Rajput kingdom of Kota to show you a history painting that does some of the same work that I've been talking about today, but that has the sharpest dichotomy that I'm aware of between what is known and what is shown. This is a detail from a large painting on cloth, which is in the collection of the Kota Palace, a painting in which Bhim Singh, an 18th century king of Kota, who was also a loyal Mughal Mansabdar, was sent off on a campaign to capture another disloyal Mughal governor, Kilich Khan. And here, Bhim Singh is confronting Kilich Khan. And at this climactic moment, Bhim Singh is beheading Kilich Khan. So you see Bhim Singh with his turban holding the shield above his head on your left, and you see Kilich Khan whose head is tumbling off his body. However, from textual sources, we know all too well that it was Bhim Singh who died in this battle, while Kilich Khan lived for another 28 years. So what does this painting mean? And what use is it to make an image that diverges so greatly from the textual history, which is perfectly well known? A scholar who has studied this event tells us that in this battle, Bhim Singh was lured to his death in an ambush. And so even though he died, Bhim Singh attained a heroic death, while Kilich Khan obtained an dishonorable victory. And so in this sense, Bhim Singh might be seen as a moral victor, even if he wasn't the factual victor. Perhaps this painting is offering us that view. Any descendant who would see this painting of Bhim Singh, or the many versions that are made after this which show this same improbable scene, would be seeing a painting of Bhim Singh beheading Kilich Khan, knowing that it is the exact opposite of what actually happened. At the same time, he is seeing what should have happened. And so this painting makes the viewer all the more sharply aware of the gap between life's values and life's vagaries. This kind of interpretation is very attractive to me because so many of the paintings that give a version of events that contradicts the textual versions that historians tend to trust more, so many of these paintings that diverge are interpreted as childish, self-delusion, wish fulfillment. But if we look at the paintings from a slightly different angle, we can also see them and the gap that exists between the painting and the written word as part of a sophisticated strategy of building up resonant relationships between the images that we hold in our hands and the images that we carry in our heads. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for these very perceptive and sharp new ways of seeing well-known works with which you've illuminated the Mughal world for us, bringing it to life with resonances within what is left unsaid, as you say. In your selection from these official chronicles, one is really struck by how tense a king's life was, how consumed they were with warfare, rebellion, skirmishes, kin who are plotting against you, that scene of a bloody decapitation. Violence and intrigue were really a way of life. And yet there is all the beauty of Mughal flowers under that chinar tree and in the field. In fact, the three books you've worked with really embody many of these contradictions, it seems. If we could maybe begin with some context for the books. The Windsor Pachanama, wonder of a book. What is it? Some 478 text pages and, on gold flecked paper with 44 illustrations. And it was locked up in Windsor Castle until it was disassembled in 1997 for minor repairs to the binding and edges. And the paintings went on tour and became available to the public. And I remember how exciting it was. My mother and I were quite awestruck when we saw it at the Smithsonian. It's really a priceless visual record. Court scenes that you've shown us, portraits with a likeness, so individual noblemen who can be identified with age-appropriate changes over time. This photographic quality, the naturalism of flora and fauna, deer hunts, wedding processions, dancers, elaborate costumes and jewelry, all pointing at verism, as you say. And then, of course, the Jahangirnama, an informal diary written by the emperor with paintings that were never assembled, and lots of inconsistencies in what Jahangir says, as Wheeler Thaxton's translation shows us. And then the Akbarnama, Abul Fazl's official sort of hagiography, where Akbar is wrapped in purple prose, as you say. And of course, the last two are from that jewel of a collection, the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin. So you go backwards in time from grandson to father to grandfather. Was that an intentional thing, not to see history or art as a progression?
It was intentional, and it was because I didn't want to suggest some sort of teleological trajectory where you see things, either going from less faithful to more faithful or vice versa. I didn't want to suggest that. And so I did deliberately in this paper go in reverse chronological order. I just thought it would be fun to do. Yeah.
Sheila Blair, in her study of text and image in medieval Persian art, says Persian art is not only beautiful and instructive, but also clever. And you've really shown us that Mughal art is also clever. So could you say a bit about the styles and influence, Persian, Indic, and European? I mean, the contemporaries of the Mughals were the Safavids and the Ottomans, of course. And Humayun had brought back Persian artisans and language from when he sought refuge there, a shift away from the Turkic of Barbar's time. There's that wonderful mural, of course, at Chehel Sutun Palace in Isfahan. Yeah. And the illustrated book as an art form, of course, emerged from Persia. But we also know European Renaissance was copied in Akbar's time. So give us some sense of style.
Yeah, so the book was something incredibly important in the culture to which the Mughals were born, or to which indeed they aspired. Because even for their ancestors, the Timurids, having a library, having an atelier, commissioning artists, collecting beautiful books, reading them, sharing the reading of them, was something of great importance. It was a set of skills to be cultivated. And I don't just mean the skill of the artist who made the book, but the skill of reading them. So just as we like to imagine gatherings in which people are sharing literary texts, they are reciting couplets of poetry to each other, and each person is able to best the other in the subtlety of their interpretation. There was also a similar culture of competitive connoisseurship in the looking at illustrations in books. So often you see depicted these little majlises or gatherings in which people are sitting on a carpet, perhaps sharing a cup of wine, and also passing books to each other. And the purpose of this kind of communal viewing in a small gathering would be to almost compete with each other in terms of your ability to see more and more subtle details or significance in the illustrations that were there. What is the artist trying to do? How is the artist relating to the poem that his painting might be accompanying? Um, so the artist would try to hide certain clues or cues, and the readers would try to best each other in picking up perhaps even more than the artist intended. How important books were to these people can be gauged by the fact that when Humayun was at his most pitiable, when he had lost his kingdom to Sher Shah Suri, when he was wandering through the desert, asking one potential ally after another for help in trying to recoup his kingdom, in the most dire straits, he still had his artists with him, and he actually records the, or rather people who have remembered his time actually record how when he saw a particularly fascinating bird in his encampment which flew into his tent, he asked for the tent flaps to be shut so that the bird is trapped inside, and he gets an artist to come and make a picture of it. When he is a supplicant at the court of the Shah of Iran begging for some money and some troops in order to reconquer his kingdom, he is simultaneously telling the Shah of Iran that he's been completely dazzled by the quality of the books he's seen there. And he is saying, I will give you so many silver coins if you allow me to take X, Y, and Z artist away with me. When Humayun died, and it's worth remembering that he died while leaving his library. He had lingered in his library too long, and the azan was called, and he was hurrying out, and he stumbled and tripped and fell down the stairs. So when he died, he left his son a library reputed to have 4,000 books in it. And when Akbar died, he left behind a library that had 24,000 books in it. So the investment in producing books, in supporting an atelier, and in getting these, getting words embellished by the finest calligraphy, the finest illumination, the finest illustration, was something incredibly important for this culture. As you rightly point out, Mughal art, which starts out as a tradition that is kind of borrowed from the Persians, because you have the great artists coming from the Persian court and working for Humayun, very quickly develops a character of its own. And it develops this not just through its encounter with European art, where a lot of artists get fascinated by perspective, by shading, by three-dimensionality, by portraiture. But what is not remarked upon so much is the very strong presence also of the artists from local Indian traditions who were inducted into the atelier, and who bring with them a certain kind of sensibility, certain organizational principles, which stay in Mughal painting for a very, very long time. So it's actually three strands. It's the Desi India, it's the Persian Safavid, and it's European Renaissance, which somehow magically meld into what we see in Mughal painting.
Yes, and I mean, if we really most objects of art often had carried some sort of script. I mean, writing and script had become a sort of hallmark of works of art produced in Persia, I think. And even if we look at a comparative object of the time, the famous Ardabil carpets, they have text in a verse in the inscription.
Yeah.
And of course, we know the importance of the book in Islam.
Yes.
So you conclude that painting is interpretation rather than representation. And like poetry, it presents a truth more real than reality and deeper than the facts. So could we explore some of the ways you get there and some of the underlying theory? It may be anachronistic to talk about film, but Alfred Hitchcock famously said that watching a well-made film, we don't sit by as spectators, we participate. And these paintings are, in a sense, thrillers. We watch the spectacle. As readers, we actively interpret what is going on. And as reader reception theory would show us, you give readers the agency.
Yes.
were these texts read out loud like a soundtrack for a documentary? And was the audience literate? I mean, Akbar himself could not read. How were these texts experienced? I mean, you gave us some sense of that, but were they read?
For Akbar, they were read. And in fact, Abul Fazl tells us that every evening he would have people come to read to him, probably in a setting that wasn't private, probably in a majlis, which included a few other people as well. And that at the conclusion of the day's reading, Akbar would put a mark on the text to mark the place where they had stopped. No? We also know the name of some of the storytellers whom Akbar was very fond of and who accompanied him from place to place. The fact that Akbar, despite being dyslexic and being unable to read, would want to expand the atelier where he hires more than 100 artists and he gets tens of thousands of books commissioned, means that it wasn't just a personal act of reading or communing with a book that was important. It was an understanding of the importance of gathering knowledge. It was the importance of being cultivated, having the civility, the culture in order to possess books. And in fact, at the time, even Akbar's inability to read was not seen necessarily as a great deficiency, because there were many people in history who were unlettered, because being lettered was not necessary in everybody's life. And even the Prophet Muhammad had not been lettered. And so that actually aligned Akbar with him. And the fact that he had the kind of memory, the curiosity that he had, that he could retain what was in books without reading books, was also, considered a mark of his greatness. Having said that, we do know about all the other emperors and many of the other princes and their skill in reading and writing. We have calligraphic samples from Dara Shikoh, from Aurangzeb, from Jahangir, from Shah Jahan, from so many people. So we see that as part of their education, reading, writing was something that was important. And it was part of being a cultured person. The reading of books, as I've suggested to you, was not necessarily a private matter, but it was something that was shared in a majlis-like setting. And actually, when you start looking at Mughal paintings for this, you see an extraordinary number of depictions of these kinds of convivial gatherings in which books are collectively being read. And as I said earlier, then there is probably a competitive aesthetics at play over here, where people are trying to outdo each other in their ability to take in subtleties, both in the image and in the text.
So let's just pause for a minute on theory a bit, take this a bit further. Some insights from film theory that might be useful. The act of seeing, of course, is determined by power hierarchies. And this is very much part of your argument. I'm thinking of Laura Mulvey's generative 1975 essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, and on the male gaze. And here the painting of Khan Jahan's beheading with the horizon of soldiers looking,
Yes.
the beheader and the lancer watching, Khan Jahan alive with open eyes. And as viewers, we participate and witness too. And there are conventions of composition, of course, that viewers would recognize, such as the three registers that reflect the power structure in court scenes with the emperor at the top. And you argue that despite this being the proved version of events for a royal chronicle, the gap between reality and its representation, what is known about the relationship between Aziz Koka and Jahangir and what is shown, what actually happened and what should have happened, urges the reader to create a third text. And you mentioned also that you come from a literature background. So the literary critic Homi Bhabha used the term third space to describe something liminal and in between in the interstices. Could you elaborate on that idea a bit of a third text?
Well, I think the challenge in looking at this kind of material would be to inhabit a position that is not the position of the patron, right? I think the hardest challenge here is to try and read these through subaltern perspectives, to try and read these through gendered perspectives, so that we are not imaginatively always projecting ourselves as though we were Akbar or Jahangir or Shah Jahan and reading them as though they were intended for us, but to think of the makers and the many different kind of viewers, the people for whom perhaps the viewing of some of these images would be painful or humiliating, or disturbing in many ways. So I think that these are highly ideologically charged paintings produced for a court context. They're very beautiful. As you said right at the outset, there is this strange contradiction or tension between the ugly realities of life, where you as a Mughal prince might lose your head tomorrow, and yet there is the today in which you're clad in silks and velvets and, eating the finest melons from Central Asia and cooling your sharbat with ice that has been brought from Kashmir. So there is this strange kind of duality to life or precarity to life. But I think the hardest thing to try and do is to step out of the skin of the intended patron and to think about subaltern positions and to think about the position of the artist, to think about the position of the servant, the groom, the votaries or the supporters of the person who is being punished or executed, the wife of Khusro. It's to think about these kinds of things and to imagine how images might have operated in these kinds of circumstances becomes the most challenging. I think that the closest we can come to this kind of divergent dialogue, perhaps in the realm of Mughal paintings, would be to take versions that are made for the Mughal court and to take versions that are made for Rajput courts, where sometimes the ateliers of the Mughal Mansabdars are giving utterance to a very different version of events. So I think it would be very productive to put those in conjunction with each other. But for the most part, I think what we have to imagine when we're reading these images is to imagine all the things that they don't show, the women who are not depicted, the servants who are not shown.
Absence of women, of course, in these, in what you've shown us, because of course there are scenes of warfare and court scenes and so on.
And the engagement of women in all of this, right? So when you have Khusro revolting, you think about his mother and you think about what kind of situation she occupies and what that narrative of the event or the way things unfold, what it means in her ears. In fact, Khusro's mother actually was so distraught at the turn of events that she committed suicide. So, these are not things that are presented in the official chronicles, but they definitely become things to think with and to open out the world of the image, for the third space, as you are suggesting.
On the, I'll take some questions from the audience at this point. Mohan Rao has written in, it is always a pleasure to hear you. Your fascinating talks are not only aesthetically pleasing, but also intellectually stimulating. Colonial history from Mills onwards presents India as home to two communities, Hindu and Muslim, eternally at war with each other. And what does Mughal art tell us about this? I mean, here you have a Hindu artist, Govardhan, doing the Jahangirnama work, right? And also, of course, all the complexities in the situations you've described. And Jahangir and Shah Jahan had Rajput mothers. So Khan Jahan Lodi enters into a pact with the Sultan of Ahmednagar, another Muslim ruler, against Shah Jahan. He's killed by Madhu Singh of Bundi, a Rajput prince who's in Shah Jahan's service. Raja Man Singh of Amber is Akbar's brother-in-law and close friend who saves his life. And Said Muzaffar, a Muslim, in turn saves Man Singh's life. Bhim Singh, of course, king of Kota, is a loyal Mughal Mansabdar and dies fighting Kilij Khan for rebelling against the Mughals. So just can you give us a sense of the mixity of this world?
Prateeti, I think you've already done a great job of
Sorry, I didn't.
that.
I was
So you've
trying
done
to
a great
summarize
job.
the three
Done
things.
a great job of that because you have so many intermarriages and close familial connections. So it's not just that Jahangir might have a Rajput mother, but his children will have Rajput grandparents and uncles and cousins. And they
That's
will
right.
have grown up in a very mixed kind of set of customs and relationships and
Languages.
shared experience and languages. In fact, I think the language that was commonly spoken within the zenana of the palace and which emperors would use to speak to the family would be something akin to Braj Bhasha. So, the image that we have today is very, very different and doesn't reflect the kind of intertwined relationships and the complex intertwining and or the complete intertwining, the genetic intertwining that took place. Because not only do you have Rajput families that have married into the Mughal family, but they have benefited tremendously by it. So they are seeking these alliances and they are benefiting by being mansabdars, where they are multiplying in their power and their wealth and their influence. It's so when you look at the palaces also that the Rajputs built for themselves, they bear the very strong mark of Mughal culture. If you want to really understand a Mughal palace, um, you go to Delhi and so much has been ruined in the fort in Delhi. The best way to understand the speciality of a Mughal palace would actually be to go to Amber outside Jaipur and see the wonderfully intact Diwan-e-Aam, and which still bears so much of its fine decoration. So there is a tremendous, there's tremendous affinity, intermingling and affinity, and there are ties which have to be ties of love and of family that are binding people together. But it should be also said that when the Mughal hold over power weakens and when the empire starts to disintegrate, and in the 18th century, when you have former mansabdars realizing that they don't have to pay taxes, they don't have to report to the Mughal emperor because the emperor just doesn't have the power to hold them to anything anymore. As they assert their sovereignty, they do take recourse to cultural markers that are quite consciously religious in their orientation. So you have the commissioning of manuscripts of lots and lots of Ramayans and Mahabharats and Bhagavad Purans. You have the building of temples in pilgrimage spots. You have the revival of grand yagyas and other Vedic rituals. So there is a conscious revivification of an identity. Now that power and authority is not coming from this source, you have a turning to that source to consolidate your power or to vie with your peers to establish some kind of superiority.
Thank you. If we could pause for a bit on the workshop and the circumstances of the making, the conditions of production. Your opening frame was in the kitabkhana, and the word itself and the structure of the atelier was Persian in origin. There was a master designer and then various specialists under him for each part of the process. So what was the power structure within the kitabkhana? Calligraphers were higher in status than painters, weren't they?
Much.
Are some of the gaps here the result of rivalry between them, there was bound to be when they worked chemically?
Yes.
Calligraphers were literate, but were artists literate? And what were the languages spoken by them? Would it have been Persian, Urdu, or Hindavi, or some kind of Creole that evolved in the workshops? Was there some work in Devanagari, and would Govardhan, the artist of the second work, have known some Sanskrit? I ask this because, languages and scripts also play out power relationships. And did they understand the text if it was read out, or did they just work on a small piece that they were signed, such as those explicit borders with scrolling vines? Like other Mughal paintings, these were collages, I assume, with the borders being stuck on the painting. So the guy who did borders did just that, like piecework. And in fact, we have a question from Kadambur Neeraj, who asks why the hashiyas, the borders the margins seem so austere. Is it because because the scene is action-packed and they, didn't want too ornamental a hashiya? Or is this a stylistic mode while illustrating royal biographies?
Okay, that's a bunch of questions. Let me see if I can. No, if I can answer them. So to address the last one first about the, the disappointment of the margins of these paintings. Actually, the very, very elaborate margins are something that we see not so much in the narrative manuscripts, but you see it more in the albums, which are bringing together an amalgam of different things of different sizes and pasting them on a page. So in the album, which is actually a format of book or a genre of book which becomes popular from Jahangir's period onwards, you have valued things from earlier times, like pieces of calligraphy, a sketch by an artist, a copy of a letter by your grandfather. You have valued things like this, pasted onto sheets of paper, which are made of a uniform size, which will be the size of the book. And that leaves you with either a lot of space around a small object or a little bit of space around a big object on the page. And so the making of the margin and the illustration of the margin, the embellishment of the margin becomes something that unifies these disparate kind of objects on the page, and the album becomes the place where the margin makers really come into their own. The other places where you would see very elaborate illumination, would be in certain kinds of texts like the Quran, of course, certain classics of Persian literature, where you would have beautiful margins, but very often the expense of making beautiful margins was really confined just to the opening pages, to the chapter headings, and not to each and every page. It's very rare, not unknown, but it's very rare to have very beautifully margined pages for an entire 300-page manuscript. About the workshop and how it functioned. Although the Mughal workshop takes its initial impetus, we say, from the Persian court, the way it actually functioned in India was very different, because Humayun died very early. Akbar comes to the throne and has this appetite for giganticism. So he's building these huge forts and he's building these huge mausoleums, and he's also getting this huge atelier, which is going to make him a huge library. So they have a huge hiring campaign. And they hire like 100 artists who must belong to all the different traditions locally, and they have to be trained. So the way they actually get trained is to associate a few well-trained masters with a cluster of 7 or 8 novices who are given the work of filling in the color. So the master will make the composition, and then he'll give the page to an assistant from his circle of assistants, who will do the very laborious work of laying color or of adding little repetitive details and so on. And then you can see that over the years, sometimes someone who is the colorist becomes the master in his own right. So they actually rise to the ranks and they get promoted. What is less often seen, you may see the person who is the colorist becoming the artist, or the musawwir, the one who makes the tasveer. But it is very seldom that you see the naqash, the person who makes the decorative ornaments on the margins, turning into a musawwir. So that seems to be a different lineage and a different skill. And there are very few crossovers from the naqashi end to the tasavvur end, or to the making of tasveer end of things. So you have these clusters of people working. Then when you come to Jahangir's time, Jahangir fires 2/3 of his father's workshop, or 3/4 of his father's workshop. He's only interested in connoisseurship. He wants quality. He doesn't want quantity. He just wants a few handful of really good artists to stay on and make these really exquisite paintings, which return to the Persian mode, not in their form, but in the manner of production, where you have an individual artist who seems to be responsible for the entire page. So there you return to an idea of the artist as author, where the artist is responsible not just for the skill of execution, but the ingenuity of composition. Um, this business of the artist's ingenuity, the artist as an original creator, is something that has a tense and a vexed history in the arts of the book in Islamic courts or Islamic cultures generally, because regardless of the fact that so many places, the Ottomans, the Safavids, the Timurids, the Mughals, have all patronized image making in plenty, at the same time, there is also an anxiety about image making, which tends to return. Even at a time when you don't have it, after some time, the wheel turns, and this anxiety about is the making of images impious comes back as some sort of a question, and it may affect or limit what is produced. That is why, as you said, the calligrapher and the calligrapher's work is always prized more highly than the work of the artist. And in these courts, then, the artist is impelled to prove himself as not just a skilled craftsman, but a an intellectual, a creator, a thinking creator who is capable of coming up with some new ideas which nobody else had thought of and nobody but a painter could give you, things that are visual sensations which talk to you through the way images communicate, which your writer cannot rival, right? So to claim an autonomous intellectual status and a sphere of creativity in which words and their ability to be layered and to have symbolic meaning is also the province of paintings, where they can use composition, they can use color coding, they can use symbolic devices to create something that is as layered as poetry. The great legendary even artist Behzad from the Timurid court is credited with actually having shown how an artist could do something that was as subtle as anything that a poet could do. And then you have artists in Jahangir's court who are also vying to do this. And you see the sense of their claiming authorship by the fact that they start making inscriptions in which they say something about themselves and their work inside the painting. In Akbar's time, whatever we know of the names of artists who were authors are actually the notes kept by accountants so that they know how much to pay them. But in Jahangir's time, you have these even self-aggrandizing inscriptions made by the artists.
We're running out of time. Srivasan Sudarshanam had asked a question which I think you addressed. How did Mughals allow paintings when Islamic practice does not support depiction through images? And I think there was some anxiety about it. Would it be fair to say?
This is something that is an issue that comes up many times, and many authors who deal with Islamic art talk about this, because it's quite clear that if you look at what we think is the theory of Islam and you put it against what is the practice of Islam, then you see that actually what we think is the theory of Islam cannot actually be the theory of Islam, because the practice is so different. You have such a profusion of image making in so many cultures, and so many Islamic courts. So it seems that the anxieties about image making, unless you are in the presence of someone who is super, super orthodox, the anxieties about image making are not about image making, but they're about image worship. And there's a wonderful book by someone called Jamal Elias, which is called Aisha's Cushion, in which he quotes something from the Hadith, which is an example from the Prophet's own life, in which his wife Aisha has made some furnishings out of some cloth that has figures on it. And she asks him, is it okay? Is this lawful? And he says, yes, it's a cushion. I can sit upon it. I can lean against it. So it's fine. had you made the same thing as a curtain where the figures that are upon the cloth might have appeared to me like standing beings whom I might, get confused about, like, are they real? Or I might have some sort of a ghost of a memory of worshipping, doing devotions to such images. That would be another matter. So in many places, the anxiety is about three-dimensional images, not about two-dimensional ones, which would also explain the huge amount of painting that we see coming out of these courts. And even when you have three-dimensional objects, the anxiety is about worshipping rather than just enjoying.
And in general, you would say there's less statuary in the Islamic world, isn't there?
Yeah, there's less statuary. There is a lot of animation of utilitarian objects. So you will have a jug whose spout is a serpent's head. But when they get incorporated into a larger assemblage, and which is done sometimes in extremely sophisticated ways, but not so much as freestanding statuary, that does seem to be a feature that is there. But painting seems less affected.
And of course, I'm tempted to ask, when you were talking about the verbal and the visual, um, how much of this is the exigencies of the form? So, famously, a filmmaker said that, a 19th century novel could describe a corsage of flowers worn in a buttonhole and it evokes the whole ball, but the filmmaker has to make explicit every detail of the ballroom. So is it just some artist's interpretation of the text in the course of having to populate it with figures?
Sorry, I didn't exactly get that. You mean because there are so many figures around?
Yeah, because you have to provide so much detail, right? The artist has to imagine things that maybe the text can take for granted, that the person is...
They have to show.
Yeah,
they have to show
every detail,
Yeah.
like film.
Yeah, that's true. And it's also not true because you have fantastic drawings, which are just sketches where a single line floating on bare paper is doing a lot for you. But we tend to talk about those less. They are harder to photograph, they're harder to get across in a PowerPoint. So I'm not so likely to make a presentation about a drawing.
Well, in general, I found just as a comparative, looking at a kind of comparative framework, the scholarship on 20th century picture books for children, by Bill Mabius and other scholars, the work on even the digital media now,
Yeah.
and printing, which of course it's completely different techniques, but I find that there's a lot more discussion of dissonances between text and image than consonances, maybe because consonance is boring, I don't know. Do you find that that's what in one's work one is looking for, those gaps, so to speak? Where
I don't know if this
I was always looking for dogmatics in the corner in an asterisk comic,
Yeah, perhaps. I have a tendency to want to go against the grain in everything. So when I'm looking at a topic, I will try to look at, the dogmatics in the corner. But it's not necessarily the trend now, right? I think I like the structure of a joke, and for me, often the structure of a joke is what I aspire to in a paper. Where I want to lay out something and then give you a punchline and take you by surprise. But I don't think by any means that it's the norm. It's just a predilection of my own.
I should add a comment from Mohan Rao that I've seen an image of the Prophet in the National Museum in Tehran. And I think there was a period in Persian art when they were doing the face of the Prophet.
Yes, there was. There was a period when there was a period when they would depict him but show his face occluded by a veil. But there is also a difference between the place of images in Shia culture and Sunni culture. And Shia culture is much more iconophilic, it loves images, and it has an affinity towards them much more than most Sunnis do. So the idea of distributing an image of the Prophet and thinking it's a pious thing to do is more likely to happen in Iran than it is in Saudi Arabia.
Yes, and it's interesting because in medieval European art also with iconoclasm, a lot of the same issues come up.
Yes, yes,
so,
they do.
Yeah.
Yes, they do.
So heartfelt thanks to Professor Kavita Singh for speaking to us today from Delhi. Your insights have really drawn us into the world of these paintings, showing us the role of art in helping us understand the history of the time, but also up to the present and how we experience works. You've given us new perspectives on the interplay of image and text in what they say and what they leave unsaid. And for us as readers and viewers, the relationship between what we hold in our hands and what we carry in our heads, as you say. So thank you so much. And thanks also to our audience for tuning in. Please join us for our next program on BIC Streams. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.